Welcome back to the Financial Freedom Show. My name is Rob Berger. In this video, we're continuing our series on the 4% rule. Recall that the 4% rule helps us figure out how much money we can spend in retirement, without going broke. Now, it's only one answer to that question. It's probably the most popular answer. And so we've begun with the 4% rule. If you've watched the first video, you know that it's a pretty simple rule to apply. In the first year of retirement, you simply can spend 4% of your retirement savings. And then each year thereafter in retirement, you can adjust that amount by the rate of inflation. And if you do that, you have a pretty good shot at not going broke in retirement. Now, that's all fine and well, but it raises the question, well, how exactly did anyone come up with the 4% rule? Now, again, if you've watched the first video, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. I'll leave links to it. But it was developed by William Bengen, who is a certified financial planner, in a paper that he published in 1994. So that's where it came from, and that's what the rule is. But how did he come up with it in the first place? Now, that's not just an academic question. It has really important implications, both for those planning for retirement and those nearing or in retirement. One of the key questions it can answer for us is whether or not the 4% rule is still valid today. There are many folks who believe that it's not. They argue that stock valuations are extremely high and they've got to come down sooner or later, and bond yields are at historic lows, so we're not making much interest on our savings or bonds. And when you combine those two, some will argue, the 4% rule isn't valid today. Well, we're going to answer that question in this video. Understanding his methodology in arriving at the 4% rule will also help us answer the question, does it work for folks that retire early? For example, folks in the FIRE movement, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. Does the 4% rule work for them? We're going to answer that in this video as well. And then we're going to end with a really tricky question that is critical for folks retiring to be able to answer. And it's a real puzzler of a question. We'll have answers for it in upcoming videos, but that's how we're going to end today's video, with a big question that kind of gets left unanswered from the 4% rule. So with that, let's get started. I want to actually begin by taking a look at our digital whiteboard here. So how did Mr. Bengen actually come up with the 4% rule? Well, as a starting point, it's important to understand that he looked at a large range of data. He actually went all the way back to 1926 and looked at retirements beginning in that year all the way through to retirements beginning in 1976. That's actually 51 years of retirement scenarios. So in other words, he started in 1926 and he said, okay, for someone retiring that year, how long would their money last if they started with a certain percentage withdrawal in year one and then adjusted for inflation? And what he did was he looked out a total of 50 years. Now, he also, though, took special note of the 30-year mark. And his theory was that if someone's money can last at least 30 years in retirement, we'll count that as a success. We're going to look out 50 years just to get some more data, but we're going to view 30 years as a success. And the idea behind that was simply that it's a sort of a traditional retirement period. Perhaps you retire at 65, you have a life expectancy, let's say, to 95, just to be safe. That's a 30-year period. And so that's what he used. So in 1926, he imagined someone retiring, spending a certain amount in the first year and then adjusting for inflation every year thereafter. And of course, he was looking at actual stock and bond data to adjust their portfolios. But that raises a question. Since the 4% rule didn't exist at that point, he was the one that was about to create it. What percentage did he use? What did he use for what I call the initial withdrawal rate, or IWR? Well, since he didn't know the answer, he had to kind of use a range. So what he did was he started with actually just 1%. So even on a $1 million portfolio in year one, that would only be $10,000. And he ran this scenario out 50 years. And then he did it again at 2%, and then again at 3%. And to make a long story short, he went all the way up to 8%. That's a pretty significant initial withdrawal rate. So he looked at all of those withdrawal rates for a retirement beginning in 1926, and he mapped it out for 50 years. And then guess what? He did it all over again for 27, for someone starting the retirement a year later in 1927. And again, using initial withdrawal rates ranging from 1 to 8%. And then he did it again for 28 and 29. And you guessed it, all the way up to 1976, someone retiring in the mid-1970s. Now, he published this in 1994, so if you're doing the math, you may say, well, wait a minute, Rob, he had 50 years of data beginning in 1926, but in 1976, I mean, he's doing this about 15 to 20 years later, he didn't have 50 years of data. Well, that's true. So what he did, beginning in 1993, he used averages, about 10%, a little bit more for stocks, a little over 5% for bonds, and an inflation rate of 3%. But even with that concession, he still had actual stock, bond, and inflation data from 1926 all the way through, he used through 1992. Now, all of this raises a couple of questions. The first is, why did he begin in 1926? Well, the answer is one primarily of convenience. The source of his stock, bond, and inflation data is a publication that you see on your screen here now called Stocks, Bonds, Bills, and Inflation. Now you're looking at the 2020 version. He used the 1993 version. By the way, what you're looking at here is 216 pages long, and it's just the summary edition. So there's a ton of data in this publication. You can actually buy it today if you want it. I think it's about $250. But that's the data that he used, and it just happens to go back to 1926. So that's why he used that time period. The good news for us is it's a really long time period to evaluate how a retirement portfolio will behave. Now, before we look at his specific results, there's one other really important concept to understand in his analysis. And it has to do with 3 time periods between that 1926 and 1976 time period where there was some really bad market conditions. And let's take a look at those now. There were actually 3 of them, right? So the first one was, of course, probably not a surprise, but 1929 to 1931. Obviously, 1929 is the stock market crash that ushered in the Great Depression. During this time period, stocks returned a negative 61%. We'll put stocks up here. And bonds, fortunately, did a little better. They did plus 10.5%. So that's what the stock and bond market did for those 3 years. Not exactly pleasant. The next one was 1937 to 1941. During that time, wasn't quite as bad, but still a negative 33.33% on stocks. Not exactly a fun time to be investing. And bonds were a positive 16.7%. By the way, you might see here why I think some bond allocation is important. It helps at least offset some of the pain in a stock market crash. And then the third sort of rough time period in his analysis was 1973 to 1974, and that was a negative 37.2% for stocks and a 10.6% increase for bonds. Now, he actually gave each of these time periods a name. He was a bit of an astronomy buff, so he gave them names based on astronomy. One was the Big Bang for the worst of these 3, and then the Big Dipper for sort of, I guess, the second worst of these 3, and the Little Dipper for, I guess, the third worst of these 3. My question for you is, which one was the worst? Which one was the Big Dipper, right? Well, we're going to come back to that question. It's critical to understand that in understanding and applying the 4% rule. But before we get to that, let's actually turn to the results. So what you see on the screen is Bengen's paper. And in figure 1A, he shows us the results of his analysis, assuming not a 4% initial withdrawal rate, but a 3% initial withdrawal rate. Now, what you can tell from this is that for every single retirement year he looked at from 1926 to 1976, if you start with a 3% withdrawal rate, your money will last at least 50 years. Now remember, he stopped analyzing after year 50, so don't assume that each of these portfolios ran out of money. In fact, I can tell you many of them at year 50, believe it or not, had more money than they began with. But he stopped at 50, so that's what the black bars mean under above each year, is that every single portfolio, that's through the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam, stagflation of the 70s, everything, every portfolio, whether you started retirement in 1926 or 1976, your money lasted a full 50 years, all right? So that raises the question, well, fine, where did the 4% rule come from? Well, if we scroll down to figure 1B, which you now see on your screen, it's the same results except he had a starting withdrawal rate of 4%. Now here, you can see that some of the portfolios didn't make it a full 50 years. In fact, if you count them up, I believe it's 11 of the 51 years didn't quite make it. However, they all made it at least 30 years. And remember, that's how he defined success. You can see in 1966, it's probably the lowest on this chart. It's a little hard to tell, but it lasted, maybe low to mid 30s. That was the worst year. But other than that, they all lasted more than 30 years. And indeed, most of them actually lasted a full 50 years. Now, of course, as I mentioned, he looked at withdrawal rates from 1 to 8%. And we can actually scroll down and see the 5% withdrawal rate. Here it is. And you can see that when you bump up to 5%, a number of the portfolios really start to take a hit. In fact, many of them, several, only last about 20 years. So under his definition of success, a 5% initial withdrawal rate, depending on which year you happen to retire, could have shortchanged you. You could have run out of money before at least a traditional 30-year retirement. Now, all of that brings us back to these three really bad markets. Based on what we've learned so far, can you guess as to which one was the Big Bang, the absolute worst? And I have to tell you, this was very eye-opening for me because I assumed that it would be, the stock market crash of 1929. I mean, after all, stocks were down a whopping 61% just in those 3 years. How could that not be the worst? But it turns out that it's not. The honor of the absolute worst time period goes to the 1973-1974 time period. That's what he labeled the Big Bang. And the second worst, actually, believe it or not, wasn't, again, 1929 loses out. It's still not the stock market crash of 1929. What he called the Big Dipper goes to 1937 to 1941. And unfortunately for 1929, it only wins the Little Dipper Prize. And that raises the question, well, how's that possible? Well, the one thing missing from what you see in my digital whiteboard here is inflation. We don't include inflation yet. And remember, under the 4% rule, after year one, the adjustments that you make to how much you can spend are based entirely on inflation. You either increase the prior year's distributions based on the rate of inflation, or if there happens to be deflation, prices go down, you could actually reduce the amount you take in a subsequent year. And when we look at inflation, which I'll just sort of squeeze in over here, inflation, during 29 to 31, it was actually a minus 15.8%. Yeah, we had deflation to start off the Great Depression. Prices went down. For the Big Dipper, however, inflation was 10.5% during those few years. And the Big Bang, 22.1%. Now, I'm old enough to actually remember that. Inflation was terrible in the 70s, and we had no growth, and that brought us the term stagflation. And it's actually the combination of a difficult market with really high inflation that made it so difficult for retirees who lived during this period. And in fact, if we turn back to his paper, he has a very good chart that sort of shows this. And here we're looking at it now. And notice that for this chart, he assumed a 6% initial withdrawal rate. And as you can see, a number of portfolios didn't make it to 20 years. They ran out of money around 15 to 17 years. But what he's included on this chart are his three really bad markets, Little Dipper, Big Dipper, and the Big Bang. And just look at the effect that the Big Bang had on retirees across approximately 2 decades. And again, yes, there were bad stock market returns in some of those years. Of course, there were many good ones as well. But the really big issue for retirees during that time period was inflation. All right, so that's effectively how Bengen came to the 4% rule. He looked at data from 1926 to 1976. It included really bad markets, including what he called the Little Dipper, the Big Dipper, and the Big Bang. He looked at initial withdrawal rates from 1 to 5%. And what he found was at 5%, there are going to be a number of potential retirement years where your money won't last what he viewed as a successful retirement of 30 years. But at 4%, which you're looking at now on the screen, every portfolio, even through those really bad markets and really high inflation, lasted at least 30 years with an initial withdrawal rate of 4%. Now that still leaves out the question, though, that I promised you we'd answer, and that is this rule, the 4% rule, still valid today? Now, to begin to answer that question, I want to show you another chart, and I'm going to apologize in advance that it's a bit blurry. It's the best I can do. This comes from Michael Kitces, who is a financial planner, has a phenomenal website that I highly recommend. He has done a lot of work on the 4% rule, and this chart tells us even more than what Bengen's article did in 1994. What Kitces did was he said, I don't think 1926 is good enough. He went all the way back to 1871. And he actually moved forward in data to 1985 because when he put this all together, he had more historical data available to him. And what this chart shows you is a little different. It's the same principle, but a little different than what Mr. Bengen showed us. What Kitces is showing us here is the initial withdrawal rate you could have taken out in each of these years and still had your portfolio last throughout retirement for 30 years. And you can see that he's got this mark over here to the right with a red line that shows 4%. That's 1966, all right? That's the tricky year because of all the inflation we've talked about combined with some bad market years. That was, of all of these years, dating back to 1871, 1966, that's the stinker. That's the one, frankly, that gave us the 4% rule. If we could remove 1966, we wouldn't have the 4% rule. We'd have the probably 4.2% rule. And if we could remove a couple more years, we'd probably have the 4.5% rule. In fact, if you look at this chart, you can see that there are many years where you could have started with a withdrawal rate of 7, 8, 9, and one year turns out to be 1877, where you could have actually started with a nearly 10% initial withdrawal rate and still had your money last for 30 years. Now, this information helps us answer the question, is the 4% rule still valid? And the answer is, without a doubt, it still is. Now, we have to fill in some gaps there, though. Why is it still valid? Well, because yes, stock prices are high, yes, bond yields are low, but guess what? This isn't the first time that's happened. And in fact, if we go back to all the way back to 1871, we have all kinds of market booms and crashes. We have inflation really high, we have deflation. We go through, think about it, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the stock market crash of 1929, the flash crash of 1987, the terrible events of 9/11, the terrible recession of 2008, 2009. I mean, now we're in a global pandemic. I mean, we've seen a lot. And notwithstanding all of those difficult events, when we look at all of these years spanning an entire century, 4% is not the average. It's the worst case scenario. Now, the pessimists among you, and I kind of count myself in that category when it comes to planning anyway, could say, well, wait a minute, Rob, couldn't we come up with a year that's worse than 1966? Who says that's the worst year? Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it may turn out that retiring in 2020 will actually be worse than retiring in 1966. That's possible. It's highly unlikely, but it is possible. There's no guarantee that the future won't be worse than it was for retirees in 1966. But keep in mind, the 4% rule was never championed as a guarantee of anything. Instead, what it's saying is, when we look at a century of data, taking out an initial withdrawal rate of 4% is an incredibly safe approach to retirement spending. And so, in my view, yes, the 4% rule is as valid today as it was when Mr. Bengen published his paper in 1994. Now, I also promised you that we would begin to answer the question whether the 4% rule is valid for early retirees, perhaps those in the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early. I kind of count myself in that group. And Bengen's paper does begin to answer that question. We've gone back to the 3% withdrawal rate in his table for that. And as you recall, starting with 3%, a portfolio lasted a full 50 years. Didn't matter when you retired, between 1926 and 1976. It lasted a full 50 years. So that's going to cover a large group of early retirees. Now, I suppose there are some high achievers among you that want to retire when you're 12 or something, or maybe 30, okay? But I think for the vast majority of early retirees, say retiring in their mid-40s or later, the 3% rule, as I'm now going to call it, would tell you, yeah, you've probably got a pretty good chance of your money lasting even through a very long retirement. Now, of course, you're saying, well, Rob, that ain't the 4% rule. That's the 3% rule. That's right. It is the 3% rule. Now, I have some good news for you. If we dig into the actual text of his article, he's got this little parenthetical here where he says that in addition to a portfolio lasting for 50 years at a 3% initial withdrawal rate, he says this is also true for withdrawal rates as high as approximately 3.5%. So you don't quite get to 4%, but you get close. Now, more good news. As we go through this series, I'm going to be talking about ways that you can increase this initial withdrawal rate, whether you're retiring early and you want to try to boost it above 3.5%, or maybe you're a traditional retiree and you just want to boost it above 4%. There are many safe ways, in my view, to do that. We're going to be covering them over the course of this series. Now, having said that, it brings us back to this chart that I mentioned that Michael Kitces created. This chart raises a really important question for both planning purposes and once you're in retirement. Recall that 1966, that's the stinker of the year that gave us 4%. And recall 1877, I know it's kind of hard to imagine, but in 1877, the initial withdrawal rate you could have used was 10%. Now, all of that raises, I think, a pretty important question, and that is, when we retire, whatever year that is there any way to know, are we retiring in the equivalent of 1966 or 1877? I mean, wouldn't it be nice to know that we could take out 10% instead of 4%? Or, you know, we might not be happy, but we'd like to know if we know we should stick with 4% and not take out more. You know, it's great that these certified financial planners have given us all this historical data, but we'd like to know the future, right? How can we know ahead of time? Are we retiring in a year like 1966 or a year like 1877, or maybe one of the years in between where it's not 4% or 10%, but maybe it's 5, 6, or 7%? Well, we can't really know the future, but it turns out there are a number of ways to at least make a reasonable prediction of where we fit in this historical data, number one. And number two, regardless of that answer, there are safe ways we can increase the initial withdrawal rate without running a significant risk of depleting our retirement funds, you know, before we die, which is kind of the goal, right? So that's what we're going to start covering in the next video in this series. Now, I know I've thrown a lot at you. I'm going to include links to all of this in the description below. I'm going to include a sign up to my newsletter where you can actually get access to my notes on all of this if you want it. It's totally free. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll do everything I can to help you. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.